Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Arab upheaval and the U.S. is the topic for this program. And with us we have two guests who will help us discuss this topic. Jairus Grove, Assistant Professor in Political Science at the UH Mānoa. Thank you for coming, Jairus. And Fikry Andrawes, Ph.D. Chemistry, retired Arab American writer, mostly about politics, and an observer of the Middle East scene, especially in Egypt and the Palestinian situation. So welcome to you both. And we will begin the discussion. But first, maybe we should give the viewer something about your specialty, etc., and then Fikry in terms of the observation. So Jairus, we can start with you.
Great, thank you for having me on again. I work mostly on what I call the global political economy of war. So sometimes referred to as the ecology of war. So changes in what kinds of weapons are available and the tactics that we're using in warfare. So I do a lot of research on drone warfare and what sometimes gets referred to as open source warfare, which is the ability for insurgencies to innovate very quickly and compete directly with large, great power militaries. So that's a lot of what I teach and a lot of what I research.
Yeah, and this is part of also international relations.
So it traditionally used to be considered either sort of military studies or security studies, but as international relations is, I think, increasingly driven by these smaller wars, so these smaller conflicts, it's sort of been folded into the discussion, right? That it's not just wars between states anymore, it's the fact that violence at the sort of intensity of war can really happen anywhere. So it sort of combines part of what we think of in terms of the study of military affairs with the global politics of international relations.
Yeah. So globally, you look at this globally, but now because the Middle East is a very important theater for
my
drones.
emphasis gets drawn to particular places. Yeah. But what's always interesting though is how much those places are very local, right? It's soldiers from Iowa that are going, and even when they're not directly participating, giving advice, right? So there's always this element of a kind of a local and a global that's at play in it.
That's great. And Fikry, could you give us an idea about how you are interested in this? I know because you're Arab American, but I mean, what else?
Well, I'm a retired chemist trying to entertain himself by writing some articles to Egyptian newspaper and magazines. I also wrote 3 books in Arabic. One in Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt, and the second is the relation between really food, disease, and the pharmaceutical industry that has a terrible effect on us. I hate to say it. And the third book is a biography of an Egyptian scientist who went to politics. He's still alive. He is now 92, 93 years old. So I'm just a chemist trying to entertain himself.
But you also visited Egypt.
Oh yeah, I go to Egypt every year. Yeah, at least once.
Yeah. And then recently you were in Egypt. When were you in Egypt?
I was in Egypt last spring.
Last spring.
Yeah. March, April.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I probably will be again this coming March.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, and you are in contact with what's going on in the area.
Yes.
So, in general, and maybe we start by asking you, and then you can answer it to whichever way you would like to, and then we can expand from there. What's going on?
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
What's going on really is the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, which they are basically one camp. There is no significant difference between the two of them, except for one thing. The Muslim Brotherhood are willing to take their time to implement Islamic law. And they have a plan for that. The Salafists want to implement Islamic law now without any of them, either the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafists, telling the Egyptian what do they mean by implementing the Islamic law. Because if you go to the Quran, which is a book of Muslims, the holy book of Muslims, there are only 4 punishable items, only 4. It's hard to believe that all this talk about Islamic law, and you go down to it in the holy book of the people really worshipped with, and you find only 4 items. And even the 4 items is, one is if you steal, you cut your hand. If you commit an adultery, you stone to death. But even committing an adultery, to just make it difficult, it's not really practical, because according to some scholars said, 4 people have to see it beginning to end, and they would be able to pass a hair between the man and the woman. And the 2 other things, one of them is obstructing the road and to say false accusation. This is it.
Yeah.
That is it.
So if that's the case, then what is this Islamic law? I mean, the Sharia, as they say it.
Well, it is. It has an appeal. It has nostalgia for the masses, because they really don't know history well, and the early days of Islam, it was glorious in many ways, but they don't really know it all. They know only the good. They don't know the bad or the ugly. And if you consider really the ruling of the military junta, starting from 1952, to some degree or to larger degree, were responsible for really what happens now in Egypt, because there was no democracy, and the Muslim Brotherhood weren't allowed to really develop themselves to a political party. And this is a problem what we see now.
Yeah, we can detail that more, like, because, you know, the Muslim Brothers since 1928 founded in Ismailiyya and all that. And then their war against the British in the Suez area and so forth.
This is a fallacy, by the way.
We can detail that later on and see how, you know, Al-Banna, who's the head of the founder of the Muslim Brothers, took advantage of the British to advance himself, you know, and then how he, like, really was collaborating with them too.
Of course, we can and they financed him.
Yeah. We can deal with that so to clear things out. And in terms of how Muslim are they, you know, in terms of the Quran, you know, the holy book of Islam. And then I know you follow these events very well, thoroughly. So in general, what do you think is going on?
Well, for me, the question is also sort of similarly, why nostalgia for Islam, right? That why isn't there the same kind of nostalgia, say, for Arab nationalism, right? So for me, you know, while I agree that there's not a lot of difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, there are some pragmatic political differences. So you know, the attack in Gaza happens. Morsi plays it pretty cool as to the actual, like, decision-making process of the Muslim Brotherhood. They may criticize Israel, but you didn't see Egypt opening up the border to fighters. You don't really see them letting in just a huge flood of arms. Arms still have to be smuggled. And so I'm maybe more sanguine about how much of a real difference we're seeing, right? Are we likely to see the Muslim Brotherhood be radically different than Mubarak? I don't think so. And so I wonder how long that Salafi Brotherhood coalition can hold. You know, I think, in not a totally unfair you know, comparison, everyone thought George W. Bush was going to be the evangelical Christian, you know, par excellence, right? We'd get prayer in school, we'd see an end to abortion, and, you know, when he actually had to rule and make coalitions, he really left the evangelicals who elected him behind, right? No substantive policy agenda. And so I wonder what will happen, right, when the Brotherhood's in power long enough for people to actually start wondering, where's Sharia going to come, right? When are you going to follow through?
Exactly.
And so I think they're not likely to hold on to that kind of coalition for very long, because I think ultimately they're a pragmatic political party. I think all political parties become conservative to a certain degree. You know, for me, one of the great mistakes of Israel cutting off Gaza when Hamas got elected is, if from a strategic position, Hamas being elected is the best possible thing they could hope for, right? Because they'd have to get worried about being reelected. And nothing, if Obama teaches us nothing sucks the radicalism out of your sails, like being involved in politics.
But I think, if I might interrupt you,
Sure.
Hamas started because of the failure of the PLO, which really the responsibility of that part of it goes to Hamas, but also the Israelis want the PLO as a secular to fail.
Sure.
Because it is their interest to radicalize the entire area. And Hamas is there. With regard to your comment earlier on what's going to happen, I think there is a sympathy for the Palestinians, whether they are Hamas or PLO or whatever, among all the people in the Arab world. I think, in my mind, there is no question about that. What they will do with time is another story. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists dreaming of the Caliphate, which is one Muslim head that rules the entire Muslim world, which is an impossibility. It's not going to happen for sure. But this is the dream. So they are sympathetic to the Palestinians. And while they closed the tunnels, they opened the above ground channels to send at least food and supplies and things like that. So, and I think this is done with the approval of the American and the Israelis.
Sure.
The PLO is losing in this now, because the PLO is on the sideline.
I don't disagree wholly. I just, particularly in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm always curious about the distinction between dreaming and ideology. So, there's a long tradition of liberation theology, not just in Islamic traditions, but in Christian traditions. And there's always a close hair's breadth between those people who believe the dream, right, who want a caliphate or want something like a kind of evangelical turn in politics, and those who just think it's useful, who think that having the dream is ideologically useful. And I mean, I think you can see that in certainly parts of the Iranian Revolution, in which Islam was mashed together with a little bit of Marxism, not too much Marxism, a little bit of authoritarianism, a little bit of, Shiite theology, but not really so much, right? So I'm always curious how far the commitment will go. And I think one of the places might be the degree to which solidarity for Palestinians, which I agree is widespread. But the question is always how solidarity becomes political, right? What kinds of actual changes in state policy? And so far, the Morsi's state looks a lot like Mubarak's state in relationship to Israel.
Yeah, Morsi, the president of Egypt, who was elected last
6 months ago.
Yeah, 6 months ago. And then he got most of the votes in the second round, only because a lot of the nationalists supported him. Because actually, Fikry, as you know, that the support for the Muslim brothers, I mean, real solid support is about 25%.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
So what does that then tell us about Morsi trying to take over power? I mean, not trying to take over power. He basically assumed the 3 branches of government in him.
Right.
So why do you think is that? And it's where is the U.S. From all of this? I mean, was there an agreement or something?
We will never know what's happened.
Right.
But my feeling is he wouldn't have done it without the approval of the United States. I don't think he would have done it.
I mean, we know, to talk a bit more about it, Obama, during the Gaza, bombings from 14th November, right? 14th November and for 8 days following. Obama spoke with Morsi 26 times. I mean, that's 26 times. What in the world were they talking about? I mean, that's an important thing. And also, right after that, the truce being achieved through the intervention of Morsi, because, Hamas is a Muslim brothers organization as well,
Of course.
and it is an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brothers. Right after that, the constitutional declaration was like given to the people. I mean, now it is, I am the guy who would be in control of the judiciary as well. And you already have the legislative power and, of course, presidential powers. So is there a relationship in your mind, and how can we talk about that to make sense of it in terms of what's really going on in Egypt at this point?
Do you want the quick or the...
Yeah, well, yeah.
Well, I think one has to go to the history of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
There are really, it's very strange. People think at political Islam as something very big, but really there are only, in the history of the Muslim world, there are only 4 people who influenced political Islam. One, without mentioning a name, in the 13th century, during the invasion of the Mongol. The second was during the separation between India and Pakistan. And these two they have a radical fatwa which is explaining Islamic law, and as a result they were sentenced to death or jail for life. This is outside of Egypt. However, the one in the 1300 was in Syria, and it was under the influence of Egypt at the time. The modern one is Hassan al-Banna, 1928-29, and he was influenced by really, to your surprise, he influenced by, for instance, the Communist Party, because he thought that he would rule with no other political parties, no democracy, and their action indicates this all along until now almost. What happened is, when they gained so much, what happened is in Egypt, there was a popular political party, which is the WAFD party.
The WAFD, W-A-F-D.
Yes. And the palace and the British wanted to weaken this. So they gave breathing space to Hassan al-Banna and his Muslim Brotherhood. When they got so much power, they thought that they should just rule Egypt. And they have military power, which was illegal, but somehow the minority parts allowed it. So they started to kill people. And they put bombs in the police station, and the Egyptians hated them. And finally, they sentenced a few of them to death, and Hassan al-Banna was assassinated. 1948. It was almost dying then. The movement was dying. But it was revived by someone, his name is Sayyid Qutb, who came to the United States in about 1949, and he stayed here for 2 years, which he was a literary person before that. But then, for some reason, he hated the American, and he has some black features, so he was discriminated against. And he looked at Islam in a new way. He basically, this guy, Sayyid Qutb, gave legitimacy to use violence. And out of this came Bin Laden and his company, and several jihadist groups that are terrorizing really the world. What Morsi is going to do now, he miscalculated, in my opinion, because what he wanted the constitution to be approved, his constitution, even though there was illegal judiciary system that he followed. He miscalculated the response of the people. So apparently now there are demonstrations much more than what happened in January 25th and the next
the beginning
2 weeks.
of the uprising against Mubarak.
Uprising.
Yeah, right.
So what is going to happen is remain to be seen. I think it's going to be bloody, because we already have evidence that political Islam started to use some violence. So, and I think my feeling is, again, the United States is supporting Morsi.
Yeah, because actually, before I ask you this, to try to frame it, there has been a long, ongoing debate, say in the centers of power in terms of the United States between the quote-unquote Arabists and the non-Arabists, let's call them, And the Arabists were saying, well, it's okay if we can have a moderate kind of Islam ruling, in the Arab world. At least we can, they can pacify the population because of, you mentioned Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism has failed in its project so far. And that's why the Islamists have come, to the fore and on the political scene. So if these guys can pacify the population and we can strike a deal with the moderate Muslims, and the Americans later on, after like the Turkish Islamic Party, AKP, like it's called Development Party and something else, like anyway, the Muslim, the Islamist ruling Turkey at this point, they looked at them and say, okay, these guys are very good, we can have good relations with them, and so why don't we like generalize this to the Arab world, and this way the people will be pacified and our interests would be going on. So for the longest time, Mubarak, say in Egypt, was fighting that. Because it's even like Condoleezza Rice, I remember was threatening that, when I go to Egypt, I will meet with the Muslim Brothers, And Mubarak tried to convince the Bush administration, don't do that and all that kind of stuff. Finally, she went to Cairo, but she didn't meet with the Muslim Brothers. But there was pressure against Mubarak on that. But the point is that now with the Muslim Brothers in, right? In your, like from your observation, what do you think is going on? I mean, is it true that maybe the Arabists, quote unquote, have won the debate, or what is it that we are seeing? I mean, on the ground, in terms of like, say, Libya, Tunisia, the rest of it.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait till WikiLeaks tells us. But I think there's sort of an Occam's razor moment here, right, where the simplest answer is probably the best one to proceed from. Think about it from Obama's perspective. He's confronted with Morsi, and he's confronted by the invasion in Gaza. He's just been reelected. The probability that he would take a position against an elected leader that seemed to be able to demonstrate substantial political power, even if not political support, is really unlikely, right? I don't think the United States has the political stomach to have another war right now, right? So we weren't going to get directly involved, probably, at all, unless Egypt, out of the blue, were to invade Israel or something, sort of outside the realm of immediate probability.
Is unlikely.
Yeah, highly unlikely. Yeah. And I think that's actually precisely the reason why the Arabists that you're speaking of have kind of gotten, if not the upper hand, at least a voice in the debate, which is the kinds of Samuel Huntington-esque predictions where we could never have a kind of détente with so-called political Islam because the world isn't pluralistic enough to survive it. It hasn't come to pass. In fact, I think Turkey being a great example, the empirical record is moderate Islamic states are highly stable. They can be extraordinarily good military partners. And the rule of thumb, I think, to go to Huntington's older work, the United States prefers political order over good politics. And so, again, do I think that the Obama administration is actively keeping Morsi in power? No. I don't think that that's necessary. I do think, every one of those 27 calls, Obama was probably saying, you're not going to change your policy on Israel, right? You're sure? So the call may have only been 30 seconds long. You're sure? And, that was part of the kind of shuttle diplomacy that we were doing and trying to get some kind of negotiated settlement in Gaza. Right. I don't think we need a conspiracy just yet.
No.
And what will be interesting is, because I agree, I think the violence is going to get much worse than it did in Tahrir, in part because there are real organizational differences between the Brotherhood and Mubarak. The Brotherhood has access and the capability of generating what amount to militias to show up at these protests and get really violent in a way that Morsi can stand back and say, that's not us, right, and kind of hold both lines.
But you know, if but if he believes in democracy, then he should protect the protesters.
Democracy.
Morsi.
No one believes in democracy
Absolutely,
here.
yeah. Now my point. Yeah, sorry.
I think I just one comment, two comments really to make. When Mubarak was in power, he scared the West not from the Turkish model, but from the Iranian model. And the Iranian model doesn't lend itself to Egypt because of these are Shia and these are Sunni. So they have Wilayat al-Faqih, which is a theocracy state, allows it, while in the history of Islam, in Egypt at least, I'm sure in most of the Sunni world, it never happened. This is one thing. And the visit of Condoleezza Rice, I guess, and the history of dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood is old and continued since 1927, 28, and the history is well known. The problem with the Muslim Brotherhood is they don't have a policy to rule. They have a policy to reach to power. And I give you an example. I have a friend who is a judge in the Supreme Court. And I asked him a year ago, before the election, I would like to know what is the platform of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it just happened that a week or two later, he met the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he gave the same question to him. So the guy gave him 2 books in the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, which we know. And their philosophy is really, and without make it any longer, they have no policy, no short-term policy. They don't believe in democracy, and some people don't think that they are really honest on what they say.
I mean, one thing, like they say, Islam is the solution. You know, just like someone here in the U.S. might say Christianity is the solution. What does that mean? Which Christianity? Like the Catholic one, the Pentecostals, the Baptist, you know, the Latter-day Saints, Mormon one, you know, which one are we talking about? Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I think it's precisely that policy vacuum that will get Morsi into trouble. You know, if we look at the last couple of weeks, they don't seem to have a policy, but they certainly have decided that they're as much on board for austerity as Mubarak was. And I think this is going to be one of the great ironies, right, is that finally they get power and they don't know how to rule. So I think one of two things will happen. Either they'll kind of grow up in a certain sense, right? The hard work of actually having to get people in jobs, restructure the economy, figure out what they're going to do about trade policy and investment. Or very quickly, once the dust settles and the kind of short-term politics, right? The sexy politics, who's in power, who gets to speak on behalf of Egypt, once that fades, I think they're going to face a real crisis. The economy is not likely to get better in Egypt quickly. And it seems like so far there hasn't been a real shift, right? He seems to be continuing the kind of downsizing of government jobs that I think got Mubarak in trouble in the first place. So I think there's a complicated story about political Islam, and there's a complicated story about the history of Egypt. But then there's also a kind of simple story here about people needing basic things and the state having to provide them if you're going to stay in power. And I don't think we're likely to see that.
This is bottom line. Bottom line is, are they going to really help the people or not? And just one more thing. The Turkish model was evolved over a number of years. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they just came yesterday. And they really, the system didn't allow them to really develop themselves to something similar to what happened in Turkey.
Another thing, I mean, regarding it's the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. I mean, now they are in a lot of trouble and there's a crisis. And even the Islamists themselves are divided, you know. other Islamist organization is divided. For instance, there's this organization that's like spreading like wildfire now, not only in Turkey but elsewhere, in the Turkic world and beyond, the Fethullah Gulen. I mean, this is even more dangerous than the Justice and Development Party. So they're breaking away from it because those guys probably are thinking about taking over power. But also the question of the political crisis in Turkey itself, that there is some kind of rumblings within the Justice and Development Party itself. So not everyone is in the Justice and Development Party, the rank and file, are for Turkey's position on the Syrian crisis, for instance. Regardless of what one might think of what's happening in Syria and whether the regime is, legit or not, etc. The fact of the matter, the Turks, I mean, they don't want to get into this kind of trouble. So there are, in fact, the Turkish model is also failing where it, was created. So that's one thing. And there's a lot of dynamic as to why the Islamists came to power and so forth. That's perhaps requires one whole program about that, which we might do at some point. But the other thing, back to, I'm glad you mentioned Huntington's thesis, yeah, because even before he wrote it, or while he was talking about it before writing, and one of the Arabists who's not in the State Department, but Georgetown University, John Esposito, he wrote this book, 1992, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. And his thing is that it is a myth.
It's a myth.
And this is countering to the Huntington's thesis, even before Huntington wrote the article in 93 and then the book and so forth. But that he argued, and he was giving foreign policy, advice to the American circles, policy-making circles, is that we can really have good relations with the Islamists if they win and let them apply Sharia. But we know what the Sharia is. You mentioned there's not, I still don't know what the Sharia is. Every country has its own kind of thing about it. But the other thing, I mean, more recently, this 2004 book, Islam Without Fear, basically building on the question of what Esposito said in 92, and this is by professor from Trinity College, Raymond Baker, who goes to Egypt like 4 or 5 months out of the year, and he's talking about that, but specifically in terms of Egypt. That, now these Muslims that, like the Muslim Brothers and the people who are more closer to Qatar than they are to Saudi Arabia, those guys have no fear of the West as the other guys, the Qaeda guys and so forth. So these are the moderate Islamists, and we could deal with them, and perhaps America would be wise to do this, yeah. But I mean, again, it's uncharted waters, and if the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, as an example, have neoliberal policies, then that's, I take it, why you were saying that they're not going to be able to solve the political economic question. And in Turkey as well, those guys have neoliberal policies as well. So if that is the case, how would you see the United States operating beyond the question of conspiracy, etc., to try and, I don't know, control or, minimize the damage or something? How do you think they would be or should be moving?
Well,
would be, should be.
The would-be is probably poorly. The should-be is maybe optimistic. So the would-be is, to go back to Huntington's first book, I think we prefer political order over good politics. So we don't take democratic chances. We want the strongest possible leader that can guarantee the most predictable outcome. And so I think it's likely that in the near term, until someone has much better ideas, we're more likely to see the United States do basically what it's doing in Egypt. Give the more or less wink and nod to whoever's in power as long as it looks like they can stay in power. And to otherwise kind of outsource our involvement. I think that's the real difference you see, say, between the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, and the Obama administration, is it's extraordinarily more pragmatic. So I could imagine Bush, because of the neoconservatives, chomping at his heels, not dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood somehow on principle, right? Condoleezza Rice would want to, but then someone might push them the other way. I think the Obama administration is likely to play with anybody who's willing to play along. And I don't think that's going to go well, because I think that means we will increasingly deal with these types of crises the way we're dealing with Syria, which is we've picked a side, we're not going to get involved, but we'll make sure you have all the weapons you need. Or the way that it's, I think, in many ways dealt with Egypt. We'd like a democratic outcome, but we're actually more committed to order because of Israel. So more see if you can take power, we don't really care if you suspend the Constitution. And I don't think we're going to change our neoliberal economic policies. And so I think that's a really dangerous kind of perfect storm, right? We have an area of the world that has the highest percentage of people under 35, in decades. And I think that matters. I think young people without jobs, without a sense of future, are the best possible people to recruit for politics.
Right.
And so I'm curious to see what happens next, but I don't think the United States has any kind of solution for it. And in part because they think, again, in terms of political solutions, right? Put the strong person in power and keep them in power. And I don't think we're thinking, what would we renegotiate, redo so that people would stay employed, right? Which I think is actually a much more sustainable position.
Yeah. I mean, to say more about it, what do you think the U.S. Cares about in the Middle East region? I mean, Israel, for instance. What else?
Well, I like what you said about the number of people are young people. They're all teenagers. If you look at, for instance, Gaza, the population of Gaza is 1.7 million. 1 million of them are teenagers. 1 million.
Yeah.
So in Gaza, there is a jail that is having children in jail. It was a huge number. There is just one, the policy of the United States really, they want basically three things. Number one is Israel, the darling of the United States, which is devastating to the Israelis, in my opinion, to American Jews, and to American policy. So Israel is a disaster, even though they have the legitimate right by the UN resolution of 1947. I don't think they have the moral right. And the legitimate right that it was given to them, just if you could look at the map that I just gave you, they expanded beyond.
Yeah, the map is there. Would you care
you
to?
See, if you look at, for instance, the one on the left is Israel.
1946.
Israel and the Jews and the Arabs by 1946. If you go all the way to the last, you see the West Bank, which is few dots here and there. How are you going to have two-state solution?
Yeah.
It is an impossibility in my mind to have two-state solution.
Yeah.
No matter what they do. And there are lots of good Israelis who are opposing to this. So let us leave this aside for now. So the first thing that interests American is Israel. The second is oil. The third is really a market for the Coca-Cola and Pizza Hut and all these things.
And arms.
And arms, of course. Yeah. So this is basically people don't count.
Okay.
And they don't count only I could give you an example. We encouraged political Islam in Afghanistan. And we managed to create a monster. Truly, we succeeded in getting the Russians out, what they were getting out anyway. When they got out, some American, I don't remember the name, wanted few $1 million to have schools to educate the Afghans. It was denied by the Congress. Those Afghans, they were hosted in the White House during the Reagan administration, and he said, these are the moral equivalent of our founding father. So our policy is a joke. I hate to say it.
Yeah.
Our policy is a joke. There's just one more thing. I think bottom line of what happened with political Islam is Islam as a religion hasn't been really challenged until recently in the entire history. And now Islam is going to get out of the bottleneck. And it will. It is.
What is the bottleneck? I mean,
The bottleneck is, are you going to interpret the book literally or allegorically? And you have to separate really between what is written in the Quran as a holy book and what Islamic law that came years later. For instance, the saying of the Prophet. I'll just give an example. The Prophet himself said, don't listen to what I say and don't quote it. And he banned them from doing that until almost 100 years after he died.
Right.
So they started to say, oh, the Prophet says this, the Prophet says that. 6,000 sayings were attributed to the Prophet. And it is nonsense.
Yeah.
And no one, and some of them is contradicting the other. So there are people who are writing about this, and people start to ask, what is Islam? Is it really God talk to the Prophet or not? There is a good message about Islam, just as there's a good message about Christianity and Judaism. Politicians take it far away from their message and use it for their own good. And it's happening.
yeah.
In our time, there are lots of people who write very courageous writing, and it's good. It's not really against Islam per se, but it is against the poor interpretation of the text.
Yeah, just like we have here, like, fundamentalist Christians and mainline churches and stuff like that, and so many interpretations of that.
Right,
In the
exactly.
Arab world, in the Islamic world, there are those things too. I mean, those kinds of
Right.
interpretations. But I want to, sure,
Can
go
I say
ahead.
something though about the sort of U.S. priorities?
Right.
I do think we're seeing a slight shift in the United States' relationship to Israel, and I won't. The United States is never going to leave Israel behind, and I think it will always be a kind of gatekeeping function, right? Every policy passes through Israel, but there's a lot of talk about whether or not Obama is the first J Street president, as opposed to the AIPAC president,
AIPAC,
right?
yeah.
So we have AIPAC, which has a traditional agenda, traditionally supports the Likud party, and we have J Street, which is mostly younger Jewish Americans and other activists. It's more progressive. Just successfully completed a large petition to not expel the Palestinian mission from the United States, and won. We're not going to do it. So I think Obama is, if not the first J Street president, the first president for which Israel is more of a headache than a goal. Which is to say that I think oil and Coca-Cola are probably at the top of the agenda at this point in time, and kind of the military apparatus that is necessary in order to maintain the free flow in and out. And Israel is the kind of thorn in that smooth functioning more than it is an agenda item, the way that I think it was for the George W. Bush administration.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think we might see some changes insofar as, I think in some ways they attacked Gaza because Romney didn't win, right? If Romney won, they could have just shut Gaza off, and Romney would have said, good, starve them. And Obama, they knew they couldn't do that. So there's going to be a new game of geopolitical footsie that's going to be very different.
Yeah.
I think the problem really is not the president. I think our problem is the American Congress.
Sure, that's always our problem.
And I give an example. I was in Connecticut, which I was living there 3 years ago, and we supported Blumenthal, who was the general attorney or something like
Attorney
that.
General.
Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. And I supported him. He's a good guy. He is Jewish. And during the fundraising, I asked him, what we going to do about the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I said, oh, no problem. I'm going to have two-state solution. So I have this card.
If we can put the map on.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, no,
I got it out and I gave it to him.
There it is, yeah.
And I asked him, how you think we're going to have two-state solution
right
with
there,
this?
yeah.
So he looked at it with an amazement, and he said, could I keep this? I told him, yes, of course you could keep this. And also, I gave him a book on APAC, written by two professors, one from Harvard and one from Chicago.
Walton Mearsheimer.
So really, our problem historically was Congress. And I think the President of the United States, in about the year 1895, 97, his name is Hayes, he said it's no longer the country of the people, by the people, for the people. It is a country of the corporation, by the corporation, for the corporation. And this is even more true now, more than 100 years ago. So the problem really, I think Obama knows exactly what happened in the Middle East, especially with the Palestinian problem. And I think deep in his heart, he is sympathetic. But he cannot do much.
Yeah, well, a couple of things, just for our viewers, like APAC and J Street. APAC, America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is like real extreme right-wing, and J Street came as a response to it. Still, like, they believe in like the Israeli state, etc., but at least, you know, they give some leeway and space for different kind of politics other than APAC politics, which lobbies for extreme right-wing solutions in terms of in Israel and in the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank, you know, that favor the extremists in the state of Israel taking over more Palestinian land, etc. So this is for our viewers. Now, the other thing that I think I'm interested in what you think about is, for instance, Israel and the Muslim Brothers, let's say. Would the Israelis like to see an Islamist kind of situation, like, you know, Islamists ruling the multiple Arab countries, perhaps, but the Islamists who are moderate, not Al-Qaeda, etc., is that what they might like, because they want to, like, look at it this way. Look, in Egypt there's like this, it's an Islamist state. Why can't we be the Jewish state, you know, and what that might entail, the state of Israel being the Jewish state. I mean, what might entail in terms of the demographics and so forth. So what do you think about this?
I think it's worth remembering, Israel's having an austerity crisis too, right? They have more people in the streets demanding lower rent, who are having to live in tents than, you know, on a per capita basis, any of the European countries going through it. And so I think it's worth remembering, just like the Muslim Brotherhood, that the Likud party's days might be numbered if they can't solve a lot of problems at home. And one of the ways historically the Likud party, and I think Netanyahu as a personality, has dealt with domestic problems, which is to say social problems, is to have a good enemy. And so I think we should be careful presuming that what Israel wants, because Israel is not defined by its people, it's unfortunately also defined by the party in power and their leadership, may not be rational in the way that we think of it, right? Which is to say, they may not want moderate compatriots that they could have a reasonable foreign policy with. It may be necessary for them to have antagonists to distract from the fact that they have a failed economic experiment that's going increasingly worse, and fighting in Gaza and being worried about Egypt makes it a lot easier to get reelected than finding houses and jobs for 1.5 million people.
Yeah, Netanyahu is the darling of the neoliberals in Israel. I mean, you know, it's clear. No, I agree with you completely on this. The other thing, though, I mean, like, okay, suppose there would be, well, the polity, the Israeli polity is moving way to the extreme right now than 5-10 years before. But the other thing is that suppose the Labour Party came to power. I mean, by like let there be light kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, by America.
Yeah. I mean, what would they do? I mean, after all, the State of Israel was created by the Labour Party, you know, because David Ben-Gurion, etc. Mr. Ethnic Cleansing. I mean, you know, that's the thing. So in vis-a-vis the Palestinians is different from what might happen in terms of the Israeli Jewish polity, and I'm saying that, I mean, intentionally. So there, we might want to distinguish maybe between those two kinds of things, yeah? because they are all Zionists, but one is to the left, one is to the right, but they are all in the Zionist box, which is to the right. You know, I mean, that's to me this is an interesting situation. Yeah, but another thing I think is we talked about whether like Israel is good for the United States policy, even the imperial kind of role that the United States has, and those goals of the empire. There was this book long time ago, in 1994, by Camille Mansour, Palestinian, but he was professor at the Sorbonne University. It's a French book, but I read it in English, and it's called. It's an interesting title, basically saying Israel, is it an asset or a liability to the United States? You know, and the title is Beyond Alliance. You know, Israel and U.S. foreign policy. And the question is it an asset or a liability? And it's a very rigorous book, you know. He finally comes to the question is that it is actually a liability. But then the question comes from that is, okay, if that's the case, why is the U.S. going with Israel? You know, I mean, then that's the title, Beyond Alliance. It's beyond that because of the Judeo-Christian cultural kind of attachments and this and that. That might explain in part, you know, why you might have like a basis, social basis for this kind of policy in the United States. And you talked about AIPAC, you know, Walter Mearsheimer and all that, the one you gave to Blumenthal, the book. Yeah. So I don't know what if that's the case, and if there's some kind of movement away from Israel, could we move away from Israeli neoliberal politics?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's dangerous to make too much of the Judeo-Christian cultural connection, because the reality is AIPAC isn't successful because they're a Jewish organization, and AIPAC is successful because they're a very well-organized, well-funded PAC. Yes. And political action committees have a long history of being successful in Congress. So I think there's a better institutional story to tell than there is a cultural story. And for those reasons, I don't see a lot of chance for serious changes, right? So, you know, AIPAC still gave over $1 million to the Obama campaign because, like any good PAC, you know, they pick a side, but they also pay the winner. And so, you know, are we? And
all other elected officials.
And all other elected officials, and so they should if they want to pursue their interests, right? I mean, we have a pay-for-play political system. So I'm a little hesitant, right, that our policy is really defined by whether or not Israel's good for U.S. policy. It's hard for me to think of a policy the United States pursues that is good for it, right, in foreign policy, right, in the long term. So the question will be, I think, more, what kinds of pressure will the particular way that we support Israel put on American voters, because I think that's the only place it would likely change. And I mean, short of becoming drawn into a war, the relationship with Israel is very sustainable. We write a check, and Israel does the heavy lifting. No,
actually, this is you know, some kind of hypothesis that someone like Stephen Zunes, who wrote a number of books, one Tinderbox, and he argues that actually the U.S. is using Israel, you know, for its own imperial, you know, goals and all that kind of stuff. And I agree with that, but then I also say I agree with it 50%, because the other, you know, it's a two-way street. The other two ways is that if that's the case and you get the structures right there, okay, then that would allow the AIPAC, etc., to pressure Congress, lobby Congress, blah, blah, blah. So it's a two-way street, and sometimes, you know, so you cannot like say it in a simple way, or you know, that this goes this way and not that way. It's like more complex.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's much too complicated for it to be either AIPAC is successful or Congress has entirely sold out, or Israel's a tool for U.S. imperialism. But I think Zunes has a point too, right? I mean, it's not. you know, every president takes what exists before them and turns it into what works for their policy. So I think we commonly use our relationship with Israel strategically. But then there are moments where you would think, right, there would be strategic interests in distancing it, and that's when the kind of institutionalization that's congealed pulls the leash back, right? So it never goes too far from what we'd expect because of that kind of co-constitutive relationship between U.S. foreign policy interests and long, hard work by people to make sure we don't forget you know, who butters the bread. So it's, I think that's, again, one of the reasons why we have so much difficulty in trying to think up something better, because it's not really about the best option. It's about the option that has a history and that works and fits into the ways that we've conceived of it previously.
I agree that the U.S. lays out the structures and then lets things go as they do. I mean, that's...
We don't improvise much.
We're
not the jazz musicians of foreign policy. We're not terribly creative.
That's true. But then, I mean, we have like a few more minutes going. And because of all the things that are happening in the Arab world now, not the Muslim world, the Arab world, because the Muslim world is way beyond the Arab world, and most of the Muslims live outside the Arab world. But in the Arab world, I mean, there's a lot of things going on in terms of like, you know, Islamist politics and U.S. interests, etc. I mean, we talked a little bit about Gaza. We didn't talk about Libya, for instance. Libya is a you know, just absolutely, it's a basket case. And there's like, you can see failed American policy right there, but also there's Syria, there is like Lebanon, for instance. So what are your observations about those?
We haven't come to a coherent policy, right? And I think, you know, I mean, you could add to the list, right? There were killings in Bahrain, and they don't even have a military force, which means basically the United States was allowing it to happen and providing some backing. I don't think we have a way out of the situation right now. And in fact, the thing that worries me most is the way that we are making what is a bad situation sustainable is we've really turned towards drone warfare, you know, in Yemen, drone warfare in West Africa, drone warfare in North Africa, drone warfare in, you know, the Iraqi areas. So at some point in time, we'll have to make a decision about what U.S. presence means. And my fear is we've gotten very good at making our presence domestically invisible and foreignly painful and violent. And I don't think that's likely to lead to good policy. I think that's likely to lead to the worst kind of policy.
Yeah, you want to say something about Syria, Lebanon? And
no, I don't think we have coherent policy in the Middle East, period.
Never
I just say, you're right. I just give an example. When Carter said that Iran is an island of stability, and a few months later, it's gone. The Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, in the year 2000, said, we made a mistake by really removing the government of the Mossadegh in the early 50s. So we made a mistake, and we pay the price for it 20, 30 years later, and God knows when the relationship between the United States and Iran is going to be normalized. So.
We have less than a minute, so actually several seconds. Any final thoughts?
Let's hope for better than Kermit Roosevelt in American foreign policy.
That's right. Fikry, anything? I mean, whether Egypt, I mean, quick, a few.
Well, I'm not optimistic short term. Long term, I think Egypt is going to be a democracy.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we're flat out of time, and we will see our viewers in February. So happy holidays.
Thank you.